Introducing the RE engine back in 2017, Resident Evil 7 remains a remarkable achievement in the survival horror space. At the time, Capcom presented Resident Evil 7 as a kind of soft reboot for the series, moving to a pure first-person camera view, and built from the ground up with VR support. The RE engine allowed for photorealistic materials, lighting, and beautifully motion-captured performances, all put in close-up as we explored a darkened, derelict house. Each detail, every gruesome moment is, sometimes nauseatingly, put right against the camera's frame. It was a gamble on a technical level, and on a game design level, it was a huge departure from the series template, but it paid off, giving us one of the best Resident Evil games in years. Now, the RE engine has since been Capcom's technology of choice for all Resident Evil titles since, remakes and new releases alike. But Resident Evil 7 still marks a kind of defining point in the series, a special moment of transition as the team moved to the then new PlayStation 4 and Xbox One systems. Today then, we have the next major release for Resident Evil 7, a full next-gen update alongside likewise updates for Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes on PS5, Xbox Series X and S. Now, Oliver Mackenzie has already covered the 2 remakes, but essentially all 3 games receive extra modes for RayTracing and 120Hz. The focus being squarely on Resident Evil 7 for today then, the question is pretty simple. Being the first RE engine title, just how big is the visual upgrade today against last-gen machines? Does performance hold at 60 FPS even with RayTracing enabled? And the other key part, does the Xbox Series S also hand in a solid frame rate with this RayTracing enabled too? Let's find out. Let's start with the new stuff. On PS5, Series X and even Series S, there are 2 new graphics toggles added for their next-gen apps. You get one for a RayTracing mode, and another switch for a high frame rate mode, or in other words, 120Hz. There isn't much in the way of explanation really, but as you'd maybe expect, this 120Hz mode and the RayTracing mode aren't compatible with each other. They can't be enabled at the same time, in other words. Also, interestingly, the resolution target doesn't change either way, regardless of which mode you select, even 120Hz. So the PS5 and Series X releases have a 3840x2160 target, 4K achieved through what appears to be reconstruction. There's also some signs of a potentially lower pixel count at points, but typically we've got a 4K picture here. And meanwhile, Series S targets 2560x1440, once more though, through a similar form of reconstruction. But again, regardless of whether you have RayTracing turned on or off on each console, or even use the 120Hz mode, these targets stay in place. 4K on PS5 and Series X, and 1440p on Series S. Moving to a 3-way split between the next-gen machines, there isn't much to split PS5, Series X and Series S in their visuals. We've got RayTracing enabled here on all 3, and honestly the biggest difference is in Series S's use of a 1440p resolution target up against 4K on the others. But honestly, given the heavy post-processing, the use of reconstruction, the temporal anti-aliasing, all that combines to create a quite blurry image on all 3 in motion. Series S puts in a genuinely decent picture by comparison, even if the pixel target is lower. And fundamentally, the woodland detail here, the shadows, textures, the quality of the RayTracing effect are all at a matching level of quality. So far, so good then. Resident Evil 7 presents well on any of the newer machines. So what is the next-gen upgrade? Well, let's take a look at Xbox One X, representing the last-gen machines, versus the Series X version on right. Of course, expect similar results on PS5 for the right side. In terms of image quality, there's a found footage style to Resident Evil 7 built on dark areas. Famously, this one deploys heavy chromatic aberration, motion blur, and other post-processing tricks, which means upgrades will be on the subtle side in terms of image quality. And to recap, the older One X version used a form of checkerboard rendering to hit 4K, and yet, zooming close, Image quality is ever so slightly clearer overall on the newer Series X release, and PS5 of course. Perhaps it's the method of reconstruction, perhaps the method of temporal anti-aliasing is more advanced. Either way, the next-gen PS5 and Series X versions do resolve detail with slightly more clarity. Expect a cleaner, clearer appearance to static moments, but don't expect any revelation in motion. Of course, the more dramatic upgrade is that ray tracing toggle. For Resident Evil 7, ray tracing is added in two forms, for reflection and global illumination. I'll admit, the implementation is often subtle and in the case of reflections, not usually in plain sight, especially once you enter the house. Also, sadly, where it does appear, the effect isn't hugely satisfying in practice, at least in my view. But before we get to that, let's backtrack a bit. The opening Woodlands area gives both RT reflections and GI a great showcase overall. Outside, you'll see RT reflections are added across puddles in the mud and to the swamps on your left flank. This replaces the existing cube mapping and SSR of the regular 1X game, a screen space approach that would appear and disappear based on the framing of the scene. Moving to Series X and PS5, ray tracing gives a more consistent presence to a reflection. But still, there's a sense it doesn't fully deliver on what ray tracing is capable of. In this panning shot of the swamp, for example, there's a real limit to the way RT reflections are used. They're low resolution for a start, but more glaringly, the reflection only applies to select parts of the scene. Notice how only the tree trunks sticking out of the water are mirrored. But meanwhile, the surrounding woodlands and the leaves at the top of the trees aren't factored in at all in the reflection. All in all, it creates a sparse appearance, a kind of disconnect with the actual overground detail. So yes, ray trace reflections are very much in for PS5, Series X and S, but with such a limit to the end result, it isn't quite what you'd hope for. Moving on to the house interiors, RT reflections are still in effect, but more subtly used. A few highlights I've noticed though. There's the waterlogged crypts early on, which now reflect the stone walls more accurately as we swim by. And also, a nice touch, lighting bounces more realistically against the varnished sheen of the tabletops, just behind the family diner. But really, the bigger, more universal impact comes from ray trace global illumination. Overall, RTGI gives us more accurate diffuse lighting and shadows, replacing the standard screen space ambient occlusion of the RE engine. It stands out in most of Resident Evil 7's environments too, whether indoors or outdoors. So outdoors, the RTGI approach stands out on the car dash right away, but also shades in the trees and the housing ahead to give a darker and more rich appearance. The upgrade is pretty apparent right away, and for indoors, small details come to life in a similar way. Unlike the non-RT implementation on 1X, you'll see how the gun now casts a shadow across our fingers. So ray tracing is a neat, optional upgrade if selected then, even if it's not everything it could be. And yes, you're absolutely able to disable it if you don't like the way it looks. The comparison on PS5 here, for example, between RT disabled and enabled, shows the game reverts back to a similar SSR method to last gen. But are there any other benefits to running on newer systems besides these RT features? Any general visual enhancements elsewhere? Well, there are a few welcome changes. For a start, environment draw distances are enhanced on PS5, Series X and S, notably on grass, as you'll see just ahead, which appears to pop in more obviously on the older 1X in a side-by-side with Series X. Shadows also get a boost, and textures too in rare instances. In select spots, you'll see asset quality is higher, notably across the car door here. Otherwise, I will say, a majority of the game's models, textures and effects are identical to the last gen release. The only oddity worth mentioning otherwise is that bloom around the candles is reduced in this family diner scene. Otherwise, next-gen machines offer an improvement all round, even if the differences err on the subtle side. The LOD boosts, the image quality, out of all of them the ray tracing features are again the main draw. With all that in mind, how does performance stack up? Well, to start with PS5 and Series X on their RT modes, both premium consoles here are practically perfect at 60 FPS with ray tracing enabled. This is of course in huge contrast with the state of Resident Evil 2 Remake and the 3 Remake, where the ray tracing modes put performance on each console between 40 and 60 FPS. With Resident Evil 7 being an early RE Engine title, it's less demanding overall, and it's as smooth as you'd hope. In fact, the only blip I've found is this long hang-up during play, just as we pull this car door open on Series X. But other than that, it's been flawless from the first few hours of play. Even with ray tracing enabled, the bolstered visual settings, and a 4K target, it's 60 FPS all round. And so, as you can imagine, there isn't too much reason to disable the RT mode for either PS5 or Series X in this case if you want to get performance back, where it was useful for that reason in Resident Evil 2 Remake's next-gen update. It works brilliantly as is from what I've tested, so there really isn't much more to say on these two. It's mission accomplished for Resident Evil 7 on these two platforms at least, and yes, again, if you do prefer the way the game looks without the ray traced effects, it's possible to turn them off in the menus, but it doesn't claw back any major performance gains at 60Hz. So, the next question, how does Series S cope? With a 4 teraflop GPU, a third of Series X's 12 teraflops, it's just great to see Series S does offer features like ray tracing and 120Hz here. There's feature parity, something that's far from a given in all next-gen releases. The one issue? Well, it's that performance does notably take a hit as a result on Series S in some cases. It's more of an issue for the ray tracing mode though. Mostly it's locked at the 60 FPS line in the early stages of the game, but you'll notice select later stages, the boss fights with Mia, the garage sequence, and exploring the main house, tend to run between 45 to 60 FPS. There's long sections of the map which simply outright struggle to hold at 60 FPS with ray tracing toggled on, which is a shame. Now, there are solutions. Firstly, on Series S, the non-RT mode actually has some practical use, unlike on PS5 and Series X. Here's the same areas running with RT disabled on Series S, and suddenly we're straight back to 60 FPS with the same 1440p target. All of these spots run perfectly as you'd expect at 60 FPS with ray tracing disabled, but I will say that anyone using a variable refresh rate VRR compatible display will have another workaround. The 45 to 60 FPS segments on Series S, where they appear, fall nicely within range for VRR to do its work and minimize the perception of judder. So either way, it's possible to get great results out of Series S, but yes, the general impression is enabling ray tracing is more of a struggle here than it is on PS5 and Series X. Last up then, how does the 120Hz high frame rate mode work? Again, the situation on PS5 and Series X basically boils down to one sentence. They run perfectly at 120 FPS for most of play. At least for the first 2 to 3 hours, there's barely been a single blip under 120 FPS, which is fantastic. We lose the ray tracing, yes, but the upshot is you get smoother panning motions on the camera and at no real image quality penalty, which keeps the 4K target. PS5 and Series X alike get away with a near perfect lock, but again, it's the Series S version that shows a few limits on its own 120Hz mode. Unlike the RT mode though, this isn't likely to stick out too badly. Typically, Series S holds at 120 FPS, and even in the worst case, during the garage boss fight for example, 100 FPS is really the lower bounds. Again, all of this falls into the ideal range for VRR compatible displays, but even without VRR, a drop to 100 FPS isn't exactly a deal breaker, and is certainly very playable on regular displays. All round, focusing on performance, it's a success for all three platforms. Even with Series S's drops, this is a very well optimized mode for next gen. In playing Resident Evil 7 across all platforms and modes this last week, it's clear the ray tracing features are the big attraction, the big draw. In practice though, well, the implementation leaves a lot to be desired in this case, certainly in the way reflections are handled. The effect is less frequently used compared to, say, Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, plus where they do appear, the effect is low resolution and missing key coverage of the scene. Also glaring is that Series S has performance issues with it, dropping to 45 FPS lowest, but will run well enough if you have VRR supporting displays. I think ray tracing is overall a welcome addition on balance, and at least for Resident Evil 7, it holds at 60 FPS on PS5 and Series X. There's really no penalty to enabling it on those machines, which is quite unlike the situation with the newer remakes. For me though, the real success is the 120Hz support, the so-called high frame rate mode. Seen through the game's first-person view, 120 FPS really helps with Resident Evil 7's quick lateral movements as an FPS, and even Series S turns in a pretty solid frame rate there. Overall, it's been refreshing to revisit Resident Evil 7, a game that still surprisingly holds up well 5 years on, and embellished with some neat next-gen upgrades here. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me or the rest of the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.